Welcome to the Computational Antitrust podcast. My name is Thibaut Schrepel. I'm a faculty affiliate at Stanford University Codex Center and the creator of the Computational Antitrust project, which explores how legal informatics can benefit antitrust law. The project brings together over 65 competition agencies and 35 academics in the advisory board. Each month or so, we publish an academic article on the subject of computational antitrust. You may find these publications at computationalantitrust.com. Today, I am thrilled to be receiving Oliver Budzinski, who co-authored the paper for us with Victoria Noskova, entitled Prospects and Limits of Merger Simulations as a Computational Tool. Oliver is a professor of economic theory at the Institute of Economics and the Institute of Media and Mobile Communication at Ilmenau University of Technology. We coincidentally met in Aix-en-Provence in south of France last spring, and we ended up on the same plane. We had a very good time, so I'm very excited for this conversation. So Oliver, welcome. I hope you're well. Without further ado, I will start with my usual first question. Could you please summarize your article in a minute or two?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here in this podcast. Our article is on merger simulation models, and these are the idea of merger simulation models is that you use an analysis of a market based on computational tools, and you use data from the past to calibrate these models, and then you use these models by changing the setting, including a merger, to predict the effects of a merger. And these kinds of tools can be used by companies, for instance, to find out what kind of merger is especially interesting for them, but also by competition authorities who want to know whether mergers may have a negative effect on competition or not. And we are exploring the latter line. So we are looking at using merger simulations as a tool for antitrust policy, for merger control, in order to predict the effects of a merger on market competition and on welfare. And what we are doing in the paper is that we first describe a bit how the instrument looks like, how it is done, how the record is in past cases, and then we especially focus on what new IT technologies, what more computer power, what artificial intelligence can further bring to this instrument, how it can further help this instrument to thrive, or which kind of limits remain to the use of merger simulation models.
Yeah, all the subject we'll explore in this discussion, but already one of the reasons why I like your paper very much is that indeed, as you mentioned, this can be used by agencies, but also by companies, which is, I think, a perfect example where you could see a win-win situation, right? It could be that a company will realize with merger simulation that the merger will be too problematic and that it's very unlikely to get a green light without commitment. So potentially the company could start working on the commitments before even buying the startup or the target. So I think it's a fantastic example where it benefits both the private sector and the public one. So yeah, fascinating subject for this reason. You've mentioned already that you look out through the history of those tools and the past simulations. Could you give us a taste of the evolution that you've seen of those tools? I know you've been writing on the subject for quite some time, so and you do provide us with a table with past cases. But before that, could you just go through the history of merger simulation in theory and in practice? What did you see? What are the trends in the space, and where do you think maybe the space is going?
Yeah, I mean, actually, the so to say, the theoretical foundations of doing that were already known, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago. But what was lacking for a long time was the computer power to actually simulate these models. And this has basically started to become more and more popular throughout the 1990s and 2000s. And actually, very quickly, quite complicated and complex market situations have been modeled. One of the first very famous cases was the Oracle PeopleSoft merger, where experts on the US and in Europe tried to model this very specific market for software, where you have tailor-made goods for each single customer. So it's a very rather complicated market, and they managed to produce simulation models with very similar outcomes, independent from each other.
Mm.
And since then, it has, yeah, developed a lot into, yeah, a bit alongside with the issues and difficulties of the merger cases that were online,
Mm.
and developed a lot of tools that were also interesting for keeping theory developing and for inspiring theory. And with more computer power, of course, more complex mergers could be simulated. Um, in the last 5 to 6, 7 years, we see a bit of a, maybe not a decline, but at least a stagnation in the use of merger simulation models for antitrust purposes, which may have to do with some of the things we are going to talk about later, I guess. And the but of course the possibilities and the abilities to use these instruments should further become easier and also applicable to more cases with even more computer technology, with better computer technology, with artificial intelligence on top of that. So actually, I think the prospects of the instruments should be quite well.
So yeah, in a sense, good cases will make for good computational tools, right? And good merger simulations, as you just
It's
described.
absolutely case driven, of course, right? Because
Yeah,
that's always then the desire where you want to know something, and so it's very much case driven.
yeah, indeed. I mean, we can't imagine that agencies will have the time and the budget to just say, well, let's develop something just for the sake of it, and we'll see if one day we can use that. I mean, of course, no, the resources are scarce, so they have to design something for a very specific case. And
Absolutely,
so,
absolutely, yeah. And the scientists who would have the time and yeah, would have liked to do this, they don't get the data which is necessary, because that is, I think,
yeah.
also very important to realize. You need excellent market data for the calibration of the models. Otherwise, you can't really do that.
That's something I want to keep in mind for the very end of the conversation. But so for now, just having a look at the history of those tools. As you mentioned, there are quite a few cases where it has been used, and you actually give an exhaustive overview, or quasi-exhaustive, I suppose, of past decisions in which merger simulations were used by companies, which I find fascinating, and very well made. You do mention, and it appears in the table, that merger simulations are rarely used by national competition agencies. And I'm curious, why do you think that is?
Yeah. So maybe first, one of the points is that we can only detect that merger simulations were used when they were mentioned somewhere in the case.
Sure.
Yeah. So when they are used in front of the courts, obviously we can know that. If they are used in the decision, we can know that. But if they have just been done on the side of it and not really used in any reasoning, then we don't know. And so there may be actually quite a lot more than we actually can know about. But still, I think it won't change the picture a lot that it's usually big agencies that do that. You know, also, national agencies like in the US, of course, or in Japan or so do that. But you need a certain equipment, not only in the technological sense, but also in terms of manpower. You need the expertise in economics and econometrics to make good merger simulation models. So basically, I think it's agencies that have a team of economists
Mm.
or are able to commission these studies, that will work with that. And smaller agencies, or not so well equipped agencies, probably will have to put their priorities somewhere else in order to make their cases go. And of course, it is a tool which is often used for the very big cases and very
Mm.
important cases. And of course, they tend to fall more towards the big agencies than towards the smaller national agencies. So I think both explanations are valid here.
Yeah. Um, if if we move now to the present days, I'm curious, and this is something that, of course, crossed my mind when reading the paper, the draft for the first time. How advanced are those simulations when it comes to understanding complexity? And I know you've been active, and you wrote quite a few articles in the space. So, do you think that using merger simulations, we can actually compute just one market with fixed customers, or could we go a bit further and compute relationship between companies and try to see how those relationships will actually impact the entire market and potentially the entire industries, and how the new environment will impact the companies back again. So where do we stand when it comes to understanding an ecosystem as opposed to just a market that will be, separated from the rest?
I think that's an excellent question, and very really a crucial point in the whole discussion. The merger simulation models and those who are designing them have been extremely creative and impressively intelligent in modeling a lot of different things. I already talked about modeling individual auction processes, which is, of course, yeah, a huge, complex thing, but also diversity of goods have been modeled in ice cream mergers, where every ice cream has a different taste and so on. Regional diversity has been modeled. It's also possible to model effects that go across markets and so on. So in that regard, a lot is possible. I think where the limits start to kick in is how much of them can be analyzed in a combined way. Yeah.
Mm,
So as long as it is possible to pick for each merger the very relevant element, so to say, then and to focus the simulation on that, be it diversity of goods or be it cross markets effect or so, um, the tools are quite well able to deal with that. But where it gets difficult is when we say, okay, we have diversity of goods, we have diversity of regions, and we have cross markets effect, and we have,
mm,
and then to combine that, uh, this becomes difficult still in computational sense, but not only in a
mm,
computational sense, also in the sense of interpreting the results, because the higher the complexity within the simulation gets, the more the results are diverse and depending on variables and depending on assumptions, and the lower the probabilities of each of those scenarios uh, becomes. And then
yeah,
when we
yeah.
want to use it as a tool in a law proceeding, then we quickly come to a point where we can say, oh, that's interesting. It's a lot of possible
Mm.
states of the future, but we don't actually know a lot about which state will come out as a consequence of the merger. And then the quality as an evidence tool starts to decrease.
Which already is valuable information, right? Because if you see several possible futures as opposed to just two or three, it tells you something about the state of the industry or the market, I suppose, right?
From a scientific point of view, absolutely, and also from an agency information point of view. Although I do suspect that the incentive for an agency to bear the cost and the burden of doing a big simulation quickly decreases when it can't use it realistically in the
Yeah,
decision.
yeah, yeah. And as you mentioned in the paper, and I like this part, you do say, well, those tools will actually provide you with some very precise numbers, right? And this might create an illusion that you are getting to see the future, right? That you have the crystal ball, the magic wand, and that you understand what's coming next, which could be an illusion, really, because the simulation may actually tell you something which, of course, will never compute the black swans and the COVID and the war in Ukraine and all that.
Yeah,
So that's
absolutely.
a bit of a danger, I suppose.
Yeah. So what we fundamentally do is that we assume that the past goes on into the future with the exception of the merger event. Yeah.
Yeah.
So any other drastic change in the environment, like a pandemic or like a war or whatever coming in between, a disruptive technology, which of course usually doesn't come very short terms, is not it's unpredictable in the sense of the word,
Yeah.
and this is absolutely one thing we have to keep in mind, that when we do merger control, when we use it for merger control purposes, then we are predicting effects of the future in a situation where the burden of proof is with the antitrust agencies, with the authorities. So mergers are generally allowed, and only if the authorities can prove an anti-competitive effect for the future, then they can intervene. Yeah? And that, of course, makes it more difficult to work with something that seems to give very precise numbers, but at the same time says, yeah, but there's some probability that this will happen. And the probability is not 90%, but maybe 70 or 60%. Yeah? And then, of course, the side who doesn't have the burden of proof, the defending side, has it much easier to dismiss this kind of evidence, which is what we see in front of the courts, where merger simulations have a very mixed record and haven't been very successful in many cases.
Yeah, there is one story you tell. I will just keep that for later. But so for now, you mentioned already quite a few elements that are limitations, I suppose, or that would make the use of merger simulations more, or let me put it this way, less precise, I suppose. So, what do you think is the threshold? So, to put it differently, should you work for a competition agency right now, I think it's safe to say that it will be a mistake not to use any of the computational tools because it's not perfect. It probably still is better than not using anything and just, you know, make decision based on what you think might be true. And yet, I suppose there is a threshold or a certain situations where we should be aware of the limits of those tools. So in 2022, where do you think that agencies should use merger simulation? Is it that for part of the analysis, or is it for certain types of markets and industries? And when do you think, most importantly, maybe they shouldn't use competition tools and here merger simulations?
Well, the obvious answer is that the thousands of mergers that already after a quick screen don't show any anti-competitive concerns, uh, of course we shouldn't throw merger simulations at them. Yeah? So we know that 80 to 90% of all mergers are unproblematic in terms of competition, because I don't know, the 17th biggest company merges with the 16th biggest company to become the 14th
Hmm.
biggest company in the market. Yeah, and of course we don't have to look at that. But actually, whenever there is an anti-competitive concern, then I think it's important to look into quantitative evidence next to the qualitative aspects. And quantitative evidence very quickly becomes computational tools that are used. Um, you need, as I said, a certain quality of data availability. If this is not the case, then it won't make a lot of sense to go into merger simulation. So if you can't if you don't have good data that describes how the market developed until now, it doesn't make much sense to use a merger simulation model to predict the future. And yeah, that depends a lot. And on some markets, we have very good data, or the competition authorities can get very good data. We as scientists often don't have good data, um, but in some markets they can't. And I would say the priority list should be, of course, quite logical actually. Those where the concerns are biggest should also deserve the biggest investment from the authorities to prove that they are anti-competitive, if they are, and the less relevant a merger is in terms of the impact on competition and the impact on welfare, the less relevant it is to go for these tools.
So let me add some more complexity to your answer and see if it changes your answer. You do provide us with a concrete example where when the court will actually rely on something else than the result of computational tools. So you do give us the example of the AT&T Time Warner merger, where computational tools clearly indicated that the merger was problematic. At the same time, experts were testifying before the court saying that the merger will be totally not problematic at all, that everything will be fine, and that the merger should be allowed with a green pass without any commitment. So they were actually in a situation where they were on the one hand confronted, I suppose, with the results of computational tools and the others of the result of what people were saying in a more qualitative way. They allowed the merger. And as you mentioned in the paper, it appears that, well, the merger was problematic. So what the computational tools were showing was actually correct or closer to reality. So do you think this is the kind of thing that competition agencies should take into consideration? Meaning here, when companies will appeal the decision, their ability to defend the decision, is it something that should be integrated in the decision making process of agencies?
Well, any rational agency will do that, of course. And in this case, it's a US merger, so the agency has to go to the courts to get the merger prohibited,
Yeah.
right? And has to convince the judge to do so. In a European case, it would be that maybe on appeal, the
Yeah.
merger will be revoked then. And I think this is also the reason why we don't see, or why we see less or stagnating numbers of computational tools being used in cases recently, that antitrust authorities do not have that much trust in them after a couple of spectacular fails. Yeah? Fails in the
Mm.
sense of that the results of the computational evidence was more or less thrown out of the courtroom, and in favor of other evidence, or in favor just of the defendants, because that is another problem with the allocation of the burden of proof. Is if you have the burden of proof, then it's actually enough for the other side to say you're not convincing, yeah, and then if there's then no convincing evidence, then you lose your case if you carry the burden of proof. Yeah, and in the case you mentioned, indeed, as I said, we're talking about the future, and we had people from the industry giving their ideas what they think in the future will happen, which, in my
Mm.
opinion, when you read the protocols, was very much shaped by what they have experienced so far. So, in a situation without the merger, and as an economist, I would say, of course, the incentives change if is a
Mm.
merger. So, it's not very much telling what they experienced so far for the new situation. And that sort of competed with theoretical modeling and empirical evidence by economists, produced by economists. And I think Carl Shapiro was the one who was providing most of that. And that clearly showed that the change in incentives brings a high danger of anti-competitive behavior. And I think some of that we have already seen in the market. But for the judge, yeah, the everyday life experience was I mean, I wasn't there, but when you read the protocols, yeah, for the
Mm.
judge, seemingly the everyday life experience was more worth than the abstract numbers of a complex model that is, of course, difficult to understand in its details. If you're not a trained mathematician, statistician, or economist in that regard. And so he trusted more that kind of evidence. And we have had another case where a judge basically threw out an older case, also in the US, where a judge threw out the merger simulation evidence because he said, well, a genetic fingerprint gives me 99.9% security. I buy that, but you can't give me that. You can only say it's more probable than not, and this is not enough for me. And there again, so we come back to these institutional settings, yeah, that those who carry the burden of proof will have
Yeah.
difficulties, and will have more difficulties if we use more complex simulation methods, because then it's more and more comes to the point where you have to weigh the simulation results and the scenarios against each other.
So, your explanation reminds me of what Steve Jobs once said, that the most powerful people in the world are those who can tell stories, those who control the narratives, right? And indeed, here it seems to be the case. If you have a nicely shaped stories versus abstractions, well, I understand why you may be tempted to follow the story.
Yes, and also, when I said I didn't meant that to necessarily to say that the judge was not competent or so. This
Yep.
is not what I'm saying.
Yep.
Yeah, but it is that, of course, of course, the judge, is from his experience, yeah, is probably also more trained and more used to give value to witness experts than
Yep.
to deal with these kind of quantitative computational evidence. And what we all sometimes, I think, and including the ones who are doing the analysis, forget is that things change when we talk about the prediction of future effects.
So, um, how do we change these mindsets? It seems to me that at least what we are trying to do at the Stanford Computational Project is to explain that you could look at those tools in a neutral way. No one's neutral, but to say there are limits. We understand the limits. It's very important to take those limits into consideration rather than being just an evangelist. And I hope it helps in some ways. But how do we change the mindset of the judge, let's say in this particular case, and more generally speaking, even agencies, so that they will take more computational results into account, which doesn't mean which doesn't mean that they should follow the results necessarily, but at least, take that as part of the picture. How do we proceed?
So yeah, of course, it's always important to have a context to the numbers. That's yeah, we fully agree on that. I think the agencies, when they see that they can actually use it in their decisions and use it in front of the courts, then they will be very willing to embrace these kinds of concepts. The bigger ones, yeah, and the smaller ones, which are not so good equipped for doing this, I would actually also not recommend to do that a lot,
Hmm.
because yeah, if you only can do it in a bad way because you don't have the resources, then it's better not to do it. Yeah, but the bigger ones with the resources to do that, I think this is not so much the problem. In regards to the judges or to the decision making bodies, I think we can go two ways. One way is to change the mindset. This is what you mentioned,
Mhm.
which probably only goes by practicing or by training, by giving information. And there, of course, it matters a lot whether we are talking about a system where general judges do the decision making. Judges that have to judge on competition cases, but also on
Yeah.
other business cases, maybe even other cases in family or in crime or whatever. Yeah,
Mm.
because for a generalized judge, it is a lot to ask that he should train himself to understand the merger simulation model. Yeah, I mean, so he has to be fit in every area. So this, yeah. Specialized judges, we certainly would have much better chance
Mm.
of changing the mindset to this specific type of problems. The other way, the alternative way, would be to think about the institutional structure, because a lot comes from, and I think I mentioned that already a couple of times. A lot comes from how the burden of proof is allocated. Yeah? And as I
Mhm.
said, in the moment, we have a system in the US, in Europe, in most countries, where we say every merger is legal unless proven that he has anti-competitive effects. And a lot of people, like also Valetti and Cristina Cafara and others, are questioning that nowadays, and I think rightfully so, by saying maybe we should, for at least for mergers that are above a certain size or that tick a certain boxes in terms of anti-competitive concerns, the burden should be reversed. The burden of proof should be reversed in the sense that it is not just sufficient to say, okay, you are predicting something about the future. You can't prove that it will 100% happen, because we often can't do that. Yeah, but it is enough if you show that there are serious anti-competitive concerns, and we cannot rebut that at the same level of probability, at the same level, of probability of what is going on.
Mm.
So basically, this institution go hand in hand with incentives. Yeah, and if I am a judge, and the rule is, if you don't convince me, no, sorry, if the rule is you have the burden of proof and the other side is innocent, yeah, and then you bring a lot of arguments, and if you don't fully convince me, then the incentive coming from this institution is to say, okay, in case of doubt, I go for the other party. In case of doubt, you lose, because the presumption is that the other party is innocent. Yeah? And if we reverse that and say, okay, not for every merger, that would be nonsense, but for mergers with a certain size that tick certain boxes,
Yeah.
say, okay, we presume that these mergers are anti-competitive, do represent a problem for society, then we would make it much easier for authorities to use these kinds of instruments, because then the companies would at least have to go on the same level of sophistication to rebut these effects. And of course, a rebuttal should be possible, but possible and not guaranteed.
Yeah. So I do have three reactions here. First reaction, of course, this will be great for the further development of computational tools, right? Because companies will have a very strong incentive in developing further those tools to provide agencies or court with more evidence. So that's the good news. As you mentioned, and that's I suppose my second comment. What will be here very important will be to define the scope in a very precise way, right? Because if you indeed we agree that it wouldn't be a good idea to do that for all the mergers, then the question is for which mergers, and I think it begs the question as to whether or not changing the law that way will actually pass the proportionality test that is one of the core principles of EU law. And this isn't necessarily the case. So you will have to explain why you have defined the scope that way and what are the risks, right? So this will be work for lawyers, which is good news, I suppose. And the third reaction is that, and several times this appears in our conversation here in the project, that when you talk about computational tools, you quickly come to talk about the impact it has on the actual substance of the law or on the actual design of competition agencies and indeed the institutional design and organization of those agencies. So it's not just a matter of designing the tool and that's it, end of the conversation.
Yeah,
Far from that. It goes back and forth and it has an impact on the entire system of what is
yeah.
antitrust.
Let me just quickly come back to your second, third comment. So of course the scope needs to be defined, but I also think that would be doable. Yeah, so I don't think it would be. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so of course I'm saying that as the from a viewpoint of an economist, but I do think that we are able to tick or to define boxes uh, that when they are ticked, we can say that this is mostly something anti-competitive. Yeah, that so to say the default presumption should be that this is anti-competitive. We do that with cartels as well, of course, and yeah, with other things. So I do think this is possible.
Yeah,
I also think that when you look into the fact that um, starting with abuse of dominance, but also more and more discussed about mergers, that the reaction to the non-enforcement in some cases is that we are starting to define regulations
mm,
in Europe and also in the US that is discussed a lot. Then this is a much bigger blow to proportionality, in my opinion,
yeah,
than such a change in the burden of proof would be. Yeah, so
yeah,
maybe in order to preserve proportionality here, it would be
yeah,
better to reform competition policy than to go all the way to start to regulate all these kinds of things. But what I fully agree to, and what is still, I think, in both of our disciplines, sometimes under researched, is the incentive effect of institutions
mm,
and the interrelation of tools and institutions. That's something that could work fantastic in one system can be a catastrophe in another institutional system because of this interface.
yeah.
Economists ignore that at times, and I think maybe the same happens in law.
Yeah, well, so I mean, I'm sure some lawyers will eventually bring this proportionality principle when it comes to the DMA before the court, and we'll see what the court will say. So, yeah, I very much agree with you. And in fact,
I will be
this
very curious on that.
yes, I'm very curious as well. In the introduction of the DMA, the European Commission makes it clear that one of the main reasons for the DMA is that competition law is too slow and that there is under enforcement. And so maybe competitional tools is an answer indeed, in a way to enhance competition law instead of going straight to this kind of solutions. But this will lead
This
us
is
to a very complex conversation and
exactly.
long.
It's going a bit away from our topic here. Yeah, yeah. But I do think maybe if I'm may just allowed to add that sentence, although it goes away from the paper,
Yeah,
um, I think this conclusion is a bit quick because we have actually weakened competition law in the last 20 decades, and my discipline has also participated in that.
yeah,
And so, if you weaken something and then conclude it doesn't work,
yeah,
then it's a bit of a quick shot. And I think with some modification in competition law, we probably could be quite effective.
yeah. Very much agree. Let let me come back to the paper. I do have a
Yes, yes.
almost final question. You do suggest that an idea would be for agencies to start with past mergers. And indeed, we understand how this may reduce institutional friction here because there is no interest in, saying that the future will be that way. In fact, you can measure potentially. It will never be perfect, but I can see how it will be easier to put data on the table. So for the agencies listening to us, how to proceed? How do we do those retrospective studies? What are the concrete steps that they should be undertaking if they are interested in this idea?
I think what would be important, especially if we can't change the system in the short run,
Mm,
would be indeed to learn from past cases in the sense to take the crucial ones, and we both in the sense of merger allowance and merger prohibition. Allowance is easier for some reasons, and have a second look 10 years later, 5 years later, 10 years later, have a second look and see whether the concerns that were on the table actually materialized or not. And I know this is burdensome because it's not driven by a current case, but the
Yeah.
investment would be worth it because we could learn a lot for future cases, and we could probably, it would help us a lot to define the scope and the boxes that we mentioned, for what kind of mergers we need to be tighter on. We need to have throw more computational tools on for which mergers maybe we should also tighten the law,
Yeah.
and we can learn a lot about that from past cases. And doing it is already done. Yeah, it would be wrong to say this doesn't happen. It is done by scientists, but also by
Yeah.
competition authorities, and but it should be done. We called it in another article. We called it like a controlling process. Yeah,
Mm.
for the merger control decisions, but not in the sense of finding out who the agency was wrong. This is not the intention, but in the sense of generating knowledge. Yeah, this is when you talk to agencies, you often get, oh well, yeah, that's dangerous because we prove that past decisions have been wrong, and I understand that this is legally
Mhm.
not so easy. But from an economic point of view, it would be extremely helpful not to prove whether it was right or wrong, but to understand uh, how the mechanisms were after the decision, how the concerns materialized or did not materialize,
Yeah.
and to generate knowledge that then helps to make better future decisions. And in that regard, a systematic controlling, which could only come from the bigger agencies, that's also clear, would be extremely helpful. I think there are a lot of colleagues that would love to cooperate in this regard,
Mhm.
but I can also maybe point to the biggest caveat, and that is the data, because getting data is easier for agencies than for outside scientists. But if you
Yeah.
don't have a case at hand, it can also for agencies be difficult to get quality data on the markets for such a retrospective.
Yeah, indeed. So we always come back to this idea of institutional design and what are the powers and what is the law saying as to how you can use the powers. This makes me think of a conversation I had numerous times in public with Bill Kovacic, who said that the number one people we should hire within agencies are historians, actually, and historians in a sense of going just maybe 10 years back to understand, what has been the impact of a decision and what indeed has been the effect of a merger or the effect of a practice on the market. Combined with computational tools, they could be a new type of historians, and I would love to see that. I do have a final impossible question that I like to ask all the guests here. Where do you think we will be in, let's say, 5 years from now, in terms of what is possible to achieve using computational tools? So I'm here asking you to predict the future and to give your best
Which
guess.
is absolutely fitting to our topic.
Indeed.
uh, yeah, I'm without institutional changes, I'm skeptical that we will progress a lot.
Mhm.
Um, I do think that the potentials will keep increasing, and we would be able to do more in 5 years. But I fear that without institutional changes, for the reasons that we discussed, these potentials will not be used, and will remain the playground of scientists, and not because agencies don't want, but because it from their point of view, it's not a good deal to invest even more in IT, even more in specialists, if they can't really use it for decision making, or can only use it in cases that are so clear cut that the other evidence would have done the job as well.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm very happy that we've put institutional design at the front and center of our discussion here. It's something that you also do very well in your article that is available again on our website, computationalantitrust.com. It's open access. Oliver, it's always such a pleasure to have a discussion with you. So I hope we meet on the plane or on the train someday back again. So yes, thank you very much and take care.
Thank you so much for having me, and see you.
See you soon.